Welcome to Solosaurus, a podcast about one-player board and card games. My name is Brandon Waite.
My name is Carter Mackey.
And this is episode 16, where we're talking about the musclebound worker placement game, Barbarians, The Invasion. A worker placement game about putting muscly men on the sides of a volcano and making them do your bidding. It's not your fantasy. It is an actual board game. But before we get to that, let's talk about the news for this week. Our first item in the news is that A Feast for Odin is getting an expansion called The Norwegians. This is coming from Z-Man Game and designers, Gernot Kopke and Uwe Rosenberg. I feel confident about the second one. This expansion is going to be a big box expansion that adds new buildings and new animals, including horses and pigs, and new pieces, including starting buildings, little immigration pieces, and a tray to hold all of the new stuff. So this is a big, exciting expansion for people who love Feast for Odin. Personally, I love Feast for Odin. I own it, and I'm probably not picking this up because I feel confident that the game already has everything that it needs. I mean, this even adds more actions to the main board, if you can imagine that.
Wow. That is hard to imagine.
Because it didn't have enough with 60 plus or whatever it was in the base game.
Yeah.
So, but people seem to be craving more, so here it is. Our second news item for the week, in the same vein as the first, is also about Norsemen. This is a reprint of Yggdrasil. This is a 2011 cooperative game that is famous for being incredibly difficult and for having a nice, big, gorgeous board that has a picture of the life tree right in the center of it. It's a great-looking board, great-looking game. It's been out of print for a long time, and it looks like there's going to be a reprint this year with 700 copies, which seems absurdly small to me. Apparently, Board Game Geek got a portion of those to pre-sell themselves, and they sold out instantly. So I don't know what they were thinking with this.
700 seems really small.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I can figure is they mentioned that they're releasing a revamped version next year called Yggdrasil Chronicles. But it's going to include some new elements. It sounds more like a sequel than the same game.
Okay.
I don't know. It just feels like you could make twice as much money if you wanted to, just by printing more copies of the first one to hold people over.
Right, yeah.
So, not sure what the rationale is there, but if you're interested in Yggdrasil, there may still be some places in the dark corners of the internet where you can pre-order this one if you want to. The third news item for the week is that Restoration Games and Rob Daviau have announced that they are making Return to Dark Tower. Now, there are a whole lot of people who are very excited about this one because this is a sequel to the 1981 Grail game, Return to Dark Tower. This is a cooperative game for 1 to 4 players who take on the role of different heroes, and then together they're going to gather resources and raise buildings and defeat monsters and undertake quests to build up their strength and then discern what is ultimately waiting for them at the center of the board. So when the heroes face the tower, the game shifts into this dramatic second act where the players have one chance to defeat the enemy once and for all. And what's special about this reprint is this is one that fans have been wanting with a similar fervor to Fireball Island, which was kickstarted earlier this year for just millions of dollars. Have you ever seen The Dark Tower, the old game?
No.
Oh, man, it has this great big plastic tower in the middle of the board that would have audio come out of it. So, I mean, it's a very 80s sort of experiment. And I forget who did the audio for it. It was a famous voice actor. Somebody can email me and tell me who it was, but it's famous for incorporating that technology into a game, and this has been on people's list for a long time because of that little quirk factor.
Right, yeah.
So nostalgia is going to win the day here when this hits Kickstarter. You can believe it. And I mentioned that here because it does have a solo mode in the box. At least that's what it says on the artwork that we've seen so far. It looks like it's going to play 1 to 4 players, so keep your eye on that. That's all the news we've got for this week, so we're just going to get right into the review for Barbarians, The Invasion. This is a game for 1 to 4 players, although it says 2 to 4 players on the outside of the box, which seems a little bit strange. And from designers Martino Cicciacera, Marta Kikasas. I'm going to stop pronouncing these now. It's from Tabula Games and those designers. You can go on to Board Game Geek to look that up so that I don't butcher their names further. This is a competitive worker placement game in which you're controlling a barbarian clan that lives on the slopes of a volcano and is preparing to conquer the civilized nations around them by building its armies and building buildings and praying to the ancient gods and demons, and then also feasting, I guess, to get ready for the conquest to come. So we're going to just go ahead and jump right into the components section here, because what sets this apart and what first got me interested in this game is that on the board, which is a nice big, huge board, with actually a second sideboard with a map of the lands that are about to be conquered, there is a giant 3D volcano, like a multi-tiered, multi-ringed thing that you're going to be placing your workers on, which looks striking when you first see it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it obviously has moving parts where the different rings on it can rotate around.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of this game. When I first saw that you could rotate each ring, I thought that was just for replayability, but actually during the game, since that's where you're going to be placing your workers, you're actually going to move those rings in-game in order to position the spaces in ways that are most convenient for your workers. So it's an interesting idea, but the execution of it is weird. It actually feels like something from the 80s or 90s itself. It feels like a very outdated sort of component to me.
Yeah, it's not an elegant component.
Maybe that's the way to say it. It doesn't have the polish that you would expect from a 2018 game.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard to move the pieces and to shift them around, the individual rings around the way you're supposed to, which sounds weird, but you would just have to experience it for yourself. They're hard to move around into the right positions and align them up. And the artwork on everything also contributes to that feeling. It's a very busy look to it. It's not bad. It just feels cluttered to me.
Yes, it's busy with the background images on it. It's kind of dark. It's not like really clearly, I feel like, silhouetted. So yeah, it's kind of busy and it's hard to identify anything at a glance. I feel like, generally speaking, you just have to really kind of look and make sure you're understanding each action spot.
Yeah, and that part of that, too, is the aesthetic that they're going for, I guess, because they're trying to give you a very grim fantasy world to be working in here. You'll notice that as soon as you look at the box art. It's supposed to look, I guess, semi-realistic, except that you're also, engaging with demons and that sort of thing.
Right.
Right, but it looks very Conan the Barbarian on steroids.
Right, yeah. It's a more realistic, I guess, art style.
Yeah. The bigger complaint I have with the components, though, is that the version we got is the wooden component version. So if you go online and try to buy this, there are two versions of this game. One that comes with these big, gorgeous looking plastic minis from all the pictures that I've seen.
Yeah.
But that is a much more expensive version. And so because the publishers know that and they want to make this game accessible, they also created a wooden version. So instead of big, giant miniatures, you get meeples to place for your workers, or cubes to track the different things on your resource tracks or whatever, your different army units. The problem is the rulebook shows all the components as if you are using the miniature-based versions. And so whenever it will reference a certain kind of component in the rulebook, it shows a picture of the mini that goes with it. And I have no guide to what these different size cubes and discs are supposed to be.
Yeah, it took a considerable amount of time to make sure I was using the right components for everything, which sounds like a pretty small or minor thing, but it is surprisingly frustrating when you're just trying to set up the game and you're second guessing, like, okay, wait, I'm putting this one here or not? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and it is a small thing, but when you're trying to get into a game that's bigger and heavier, you really want to remove any barriers you can from the people who are trying to get to the table. This feels like just a weird oversight to me.
Yeah.
And not only that, when the pieces are actually on the board, I don't mind wooden pieces, but it feels like a different cut on the workers would have been useful. I don't mind the cubes to track the resources or whatever, but having these big, goofy-looking meeples on top of a grim volcano set in a blood-filled world, it felt like a real aesthetic clash to me.
Yeah, I mean, to me, just like a cylinder type, I guess, cube or just anything else, I feel like it would almost work better.
Yeah, meeples were a poor choice here. So the components for this game otherwise are fine. The cards are decent quality. They have a nice finish on them, and they feel pretty good in your hand. So none of the other stuff I had an issue with. The board itself is really big, And the addition of a second board just means this thing is a total table hog.
Yeah, it takes up a lot of space between your own player board, having the main board out, having the second map board out, then having a card row for everything, having the decks of cards for the different, like fighting the different barbarian clans. Yeah, it can take up a lot of space really quickly just for a one-player game.
Yeah, so keep that in mind if this is something that interests you. And the setup time on it was decent as well. Not horrible, but it probably took me 10 to 15 minutes to set up. Now, granted, that's me learning the game and struggling with which wooden components were supposed to go where. So take that with a grain of salt. But some of you have asked us to include some notes about setup time in the podcast, so we just thought we would mention it right here. And as for the rules, things there are also less than perfect as well, I would say. I had a very difficult time learning how to play this game.
Yeah, for me, there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of reference of terms that I wasn't really familiar or sure with yet. And so I kept having to try to look at the component list, figure out, I guess, what it was talking about. I would say it took me a while to figure out which were the VP points, either the honor points or domination points.
Yeah, that's right.
And I feel like all of that could have been a little bit clearer or just introduced in a way that built upon itself.
That's true. I actually had that same question. One of those tracks is basically keeping track of who's going first in turn order, and maybe honor has to do with something else too. I can't remember, but the domination points are ultimately what you're trying to get, and it took me way longer than it should have to realize that from the rules. Also, the other issue that I would have here with the rules is that because this is a Kickstarter game, there are expansions, quote unquote, included in the box that were, I guess, unlocked during the Kickstarter campaign, but they're treated as expansions in the rulebook, even though there aren't any copies of this game in existence, to my knowledge, that don't include the expansions in the box.
Right.
So that means if you have a rules question, you have to try to decide as somebody who wasn't part of the Kickstarter campaign, oh wait, was this part of the core game or is this part of one of the expansions? You know, and even sorting out the components in the beginning also has that problem. Which of these things belongs to the expansion, which belongs to the core game? It's just a confusing sort of mess trying to sort that out.
Right. Yeah, I was confused with some of the card backs in the beginning because I kept looking at the component list at the front of the instruction manual and not seeing these different cards listed or whatnot. And it wasn't until actually a little bit later that I realized that there were expansion sections that had their own component lists. And so that obviously made that easier, but it just wasn't something, I just didn't know that at first. And it included flipping around even later on.
Yeah, I had the exact same problem. The solo rules are also included in that expansion section, and this does have dedicated solo rules in spite of the fact that the outside of the box says it plays 2 to 4. So I'm not quite sure what that was about, but maybe they just didn't feel confident in the solo rules, and for good reason, because the solo rules for this game are underwhelming.
Right. I mean, they dedicate a decent amount of space for them to explain how they work.
Yeah, it is a decent sized rule set for the solo rules that does change several things about setup and things from the base game that are important to know, that does cause you to flip back and forth quite a bit. But overall, it's not a terribly written rule set. It's easy enough to get through and to wrap your head around, I think, if you can wrap your head around the normal game. At the center of this game is a worker placement mechanism that's a little bit different from other games that you probably played. In normal worker placement games, you just put your worker on a spot, and whatever that spot says to do, you do that thing, or you get that resource or whatever. In this game, you're going to be taking turns placing one of your 3 meeples on the volcano, and you have to start at the smaller top piece in the center of the volcano and take an action there. Then your next action has to be 1 step down on the volcano in the second ring in an area that's connected to the action you chose first. And then the third ring after that has to be connected to your second. And so what's innovative about that is that means if you're trying to plan for your turn, you really need to plan out all 3 of your worker placement spots from the very beginning if you're going to be successful, because you need to be able to work your way down the side of the volcano in a way that gets you the most stuff that you really want. There are some little mechanisms in the game that allow you to rotate one of the rings on your turn so that things line up more where you want them to be or something like that. But for the most part, you just sort of have to deal with what you're given and plan ahead knowing how the rings are going to be rotated next turn so that you can begin to string together strategies for multiple rounds. At least that's how it works in theory. In practice, it just doesn't feel that good to me.
Yeah, I was looking forward to this a lot more when I first started, but it was never really that compelling when I was actually using it. It wasn't bad. I just thought it was going to be this really cool thing to like make your way down and kind of pre-plan things. And yeah, it just never really grabbed me, I guess.
No, and this isn't really a fair comparison, I guess, but I'm going to compare it a little bit to Tzolk'in simply because when I first heard about Tzolk'in and the gears, where you place your workers and you let them sit from round to round, working and getting better, and then you decide when to pull them off, I thought, man, what an innovative way to use a board and creates a spatial problem for worker placement. And that's sort of what I thought was happening here, but it never ends up feeling crunchy or satisfying in quite the same way. You never end up pulling off a move, or at least I didn't, that made me feel like I'd done something cool because of this new wrinkle that had been put in this mechanic. The one thing I do like about this worker placement here is that most of the rewards are pretty good. As far as worker placement rewards go, you're not usually just getting one of a thing. You're getting like 4 resources for putting your worker down somewhere.
Right.
You know, it feels a little bit more like you have some momentum. So that part of it is definitely good. But that core idea of trying to work your way down the mountain in the right places just never really clicked for me in a satisfying way.
Yeah, me either. I'll agree. Like the rewards felt pretty satisfying. I felt like each action I was going to get like a pretty good bump to like my resources or research or I don't know, just things like that.
Yeah, I thought so too. And really the things that end up feeling the coolest when you do them are, so there's one spot on the second ring that has a ×2 symbol. And so if you put your worker on that ring, nothing happens this turn. But then the next time you place a worker on the lower ring, you get double whatever that reward is. And that feels really sweet when you can pull that off.
Yeah.
And there are spaces on there that allow you to get a 4th worker. And the actions that are down at the very bottom of the volcano are quite a bit better than some of the ones that are up a little bit higher. So that's an interesting little thing too. You have access to 3 workers all the time, but you can get a 4th one if you place a worker to get it. It's an interesting idea. There are interesting ideas there that they just never really quite came together the way I wanted them to. And really that's going to be the thing that we repeat throughout this entire review, because all of the elements of this game never quite seem to click and fall into place the way that I want them to. For instance, one of the other major aspects of this game is, you know, you're gathering resources on this volcano, and you're building up your armies by landing on certain spots. You can spend resources to get one of 3 different kinds of troops. And you're building up armies knowing that there are these terrains out there represented by card decks that you can go out and have battles with the people who live there. And the card backs on those terrain decks will show you, hey, it tends to be helpful to have this kind of warrior to send out here to fight, right? I mean, it's a neat way to handle that, I guess. But when you actually go out to fight, all you're doing is just spending warriors of those types in order to win the battle.
Yep.
It feels totally unsatisfying and unexciting to me. It's just math.
Yeah, it's math, and it's just losing a lot of things. And we haven't really talked about it, but there's research tracks that basically make battle just easier because, I mean, the whole way the battle works, is you're just drawing these cards and it's going to tell you what your basically unit cost is to win that battle, and you have to win half of your battles. Well, by default, that starts at 6 and can go all the way down. Can't remember if it's 3 or 2. I think it's 2.
I think it's 2. And by the way, we should say here, trying to fight 6 of these battles back to back is incredibly punishing.
Right, because if you can't sacrifice the troops for it, then you have to take the penalties based on whatever tribe you're fighting, and those penalties can be very bad. And if you can't pay the penalties, then you just start losing victory points essentially.
Yeah, and nothing about that feels good. I don't like war games or area control games that involve just a couple of armies coming into a space and then you have a roll-off to see who wins. I mean, that's not satisfying either. So I do applaud them for trying something a little bit different. But it just feels really no different than building a building in a worker placement game.
Yeah.
You're just spending a different kind of resource, people.
Yeah, you lose people no matter what.
Yeah, that's true. You're always going to lose people. And you have a chance to get points when you go out and do those battles and some other rewards as well.
Resources or more research, things like that.
Yeah, so it's not like you don't get a reward for it, but in a game about invading foreign lands, you would think the invasion part would be the most exciting thing, and it just totally fell flat for me.
Yeah, it was rough. I had to restart halfway through my first game because I just didn't really understand how all of that was going to work and tried to attack, and it just didn't work. It was awful, and there was no way I could really rectify things, and the AI was already just taking over everything before I could really get a chance. And it wasn't good.
Yeah, it feels like it's very hard to get started actually invading when you're playing the solo mode, especially because you really want to try to conquer territories on the sideboard that are contiguous. It's a route building war game, basically, because I guess the idea being that in the end, you want lands that are all next to each other to rule, right? Of course, that gives you the most points. But the AI can swoop in and snatch up those areas that you need very easily. And so it's very hard for you to build these contiguous areas, plus the fighting's not fun. One of the things that I thought might be an interesting idea when I was first learning the game is that there are these technology tracks that you can invest in to make your tribe better at different parts of the game as you go on. And one of the sections of that track are dedicated to knowing your enemies better, essentially. So instead of getting better at getting resources or whatever, you can invest in knowledge of your enemies so that when you go to fight, you have to fight fewer battles in order to conquer the territory, which is a super cool thematic idea, like that you're putting effort into scouting it out. But in the end, all it means is you pull fewer cards when it's time to fight.
And also, and maybe this is just from just not being good at the game and not just as being familiar with it, but I mean, if you haven't gotten several spots down a track on a tribe, I feel like it's never going to be worth it, almost, to fight a clan.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Because fighting 6 battles one after the other is just an incredible expense for you for not really much payoff.
Right. And so to me, it's not, oh, I'm getting better at fighting them. It's like, oh, I'm getting the option to fight them.
Oh, that's a good point. Which then makes the route building piece hard, because it's not like these different kinds of territories are all in a line or whatever. Yeah, I really dislike that portion of the game. Now, the technology tracks in general, they don't feel that satisfying to progress up them most of the time, but sometimes the payoff is pretty nice. So, for example, we already mentioned that getting resources in the game on your worker placement action, it already feels pretty good because you get more resources than in some other games. And when you invest in that track that gives you even more resources, it just feels like, holy cow, I have so much stuff now. And I think the idea here is, with those tracks, let's say I don't want to invest as much in knowledge of my enemies. I can just invest in resources, and I can create more warriors from those resources so that I have more to spend because I'm pulling more battle cards. You know, you can see some of the design philosophy at work here, I think. Being able to get just fistfuls of resources does feel good. But overall, the technology track was pretty underwhelming for me.
Yeah, I would agree.
Especially the track that lets you activate buildings. So this just feels like a totally arbitrary hurdle to me. At the beginning of your turn, you can take any buildings that you've built and activate them to get resources from them, which is really nice. Except that even if you've built them, they don't do anything for you unless you've moved forward on this track that allows you to activate more than one of those buildings. I don't know. It just feels like that classic Eurogame thing where I need to take one thing and transform it into 2 or 3 other things, like turn your wood into sheep to turn it into brick or whatever to turn in for points. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It just feels like a very unsatisfying path to victory.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I will say, though, is I feel like it was pretty easy to progress up the different research tracks. It wasn't horribly gated.
No, it wasn't.
So, which is nice because a lot of games I feel like that have research track components, there really aren't a lot of opportunities to advance on them, or it's just you can only pick 1 or 2 things. And I felt like you could really you could advance on a lot of the tracks.
Yeah, that's true. That part of it was certainly easy. So at least it doesn't feel as much like a grind in order to even go up them. But the whole game does still feel like a grind to me because we essentially had the same problem with this game that we had with Raiders of the North Sea, which is the cadence of it is just off. I mean, there are ways to build up your income and to get better at getting resources, but essentially you're building up pools of warriors and materials only to spend them in one big go, and then you're sort of back to where you started. It feels like we need some way to be able to build on past success in a way that feels like it feeds even more and even greater success.
Right.
So it just doesn't quite give you a sense of something that's different than Raiders, and this game is harder to look at and to learn and to deal with. So I don't know, it just gives me a very similar feeling here, only less satisfying. The other thing that I would mention here about this game that is a little bit interesting is invoking gods and war chiefs. You have these cards that you can get with different gods or war chiefs on them during the game that you can invoke for a special ability if you use the worker placement spot. And it does feel cheaty in a way that's nice. Like, for instance, being able to move the rings on the main board in a way that benefits you, or if you were playing multiplayer, I guess, really messes over your opponent. That feels pretty good. Mm-hmm. You know, not enough to save the game in my mind, but it's good.
Right.
And then there's also this mechanic that feels just a bit tacked on to me, where at the end of each round, you're either going to have the opportunity to feast, where you can pay some resources to get more points or more resources or something like that, or there will be a demon where you can make a deal with the demon in order to get something good for yourself. Really, the only difference between demons and feasts feels like feasts, I have the option to pay and get something good. And with demons, I have the option to pay and get something good. And if I don't pay, I get something bad. But neither one of those feel kind of epic in the way that the rulebook makes it sounds like they will be. So, I don't know, that part of the game also fell flat for me. And none of those things none of those problems that I have with the game were really saved by the solo rule set either. This feels to me like a really lazy attempt at doing solo. In fact, I'm just going to say this is the sort of thing that makes me angry in a solo experience for a game. It feels like somebody just said, we should include a solo mode in the box because it will sell more copies. And so they put in rules that are essentially get to 100 points before 6 rounds is up. It's not that it's an illegitimate goal. It is a tough goal to beat.
Yes.
But it's just so totally uninteresting to me.
Yeah, and there's a lot of random factors in there that makes it just feels like you would just have some really bad runs for arbitrary reasons, which feels bad.
Yeah, creating artificial difficulty by essentially you take all the different decks and combine them at the beginning, all the buildings and gods and war chiefs. You combine them into one deck, and then you draw out 7 cards every turn, and that's your pool to pick from. And in a normal game, you have like 2 of each that you get to pick from every round. Mm-hmm. And so you know you're going to have a good mix of things. Well, in the solo game, if you're trying to angle for a strategy that, you know, maybe you need more buildings to accomplish, and there are no buildings out, well then, tough luck. Which is exactly what happened to me my first game. It just felt really arbitrary that I need one thing and all that's out there is exactly the opposite of what I need. It meant that I had an unsatisfying game and I didn't get anywhere close to the victory, and I didn't feel like it was entirely my fault.
Right. Yeah, all of the card drawing, which I think is fine for randomization in a lot of games, it just didn't work for me in this game. It just felt too random in a bad way for me personally.
Yeah, it did for me too. And the same with how the spaces are blocked on the mountain. Mm-hmm. Essentially, you have I guess it's an AI deck, although I hesitate to call this solo mode an AI. It doesn't feel very intelligent.
Right.
But you just flip a card and it tells you where to put workers to block off spaces. And we've already talked on here before about how that doesn't always feel satisfying because there's not a sense like you get in a multiplayer game of where this thing might go. You know, it's not a huge deck, but it's big enough that until the AI deck is almost depleted, you really don't know where it's going to go next. So it just, none of that feels good in the solo mode either. But one thing I will say about this game is that it does have pretty good replayability. There is a lot of cards included in this game, a lot of variability in setup. that is going to change from game to game in ways that keep each game, I think, feeling a little bit different. There are difficulty settings included in the rules, things like that. And there are asymmetrical player powers, if you want to play with that give your clan its own little unique boost. And on top of that, like we said, there are expansions that are included in the game. And so if you want to introduce some of these other modules that are in here, you have that to keep it fresh too. I haven't experimented with any of those, but they are there.
Yeah, I didn't either.
And they do even change like the layout on the rings. I mean, if you flip over those cardboard rings, there's a whole nother layout on the other side. So there is that for people who have this and they want to introduce a little bit more spice here. So the replayability here is high if you enjoy the game. Which brings us then to the final bit of our review where we talk about the good and the bad and the ugly for this game. And for me personally, there's just not a lot that's great in this package.
Yeah. Whenever I was unpacking it and kind of setting it up, I was looking, I guess, more forward to the game. And just after I read through the rules and I was like, oh, there seems like there's a lot of cool systems, but nothing ever really super clicked for me. So yeah, there's definitely good things in here, but nothing just really just jumped out to make it great for me.
Yeah, same for me too. I was actually really, really excited to try this game ever since I first saw it on Kickstarter because that big volcano set piece looks so cool and it's very inviting and intriguing, and you just want to see how this thing's actually going to function in a game and how it's going to add to the worker placement genre, which in general is a little bit stale, I would say.
Yeah.
And it does add something. I would put that as one of the good things in this game. The being able to deal with the challenge of navigating your way down the mountain in the way that best fits your plans is a cool puzzle. Being able to shift the rings and line them up in the way that you need to in order to accomplish your plans. That is good. That's a neat idea. And I also like the fact that you get such big rewards for the actions that you do take on that wheel. I would also consider that good as well.
Yeah, the actions you take feel good.
And I'll say too, just the option to buy a wooden version of this game is great. You know, I don't like the wooden components here, and I think that could have been handled better, but I really wish more publishers would do this.
Right, because minis are expensive.
Minis are expensive, and games just feel increasingly expensive. So if you can manage that for people somehow, you know, a lot of people don't need minis. This game certainly doesn't need minis. So that is a neat idea, but for me, the bad here way outweighs the good. The wooden components are not very well thought out. Dealing with combat in the game, spending warriors like their resources, that's one of the biggest travesties here, I would say.
Yeah, the combat, I guess I was looking most forward to combat with it being a barbarian game and you're invading, and combat was probably the least satisfying part.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And really, just most of the other elements of this game that we mentioned would fall pretty much in this category for me. They're not terrible, they're just not satisfying, and they don't come together in a way that feels cohesive. And so that central mechanism of navigating your way down the mountain is let down really by everything else because it doesn't connect in a way that feels right. As far as things that are ugly, how they did the wooden components here goes firmly in this category for me. Meaning that not putting descriptions of the wooden components in the rulebook or pictures of them so I could figure out how to set it up, that is just so frustrating for really no reason.
Right.
And the fact that the solo mode just feels lazy and kind of tacked on. That, for me, is a major letdown. If you're going to have an AI deck and try to give a sense of playing against another player, then it needs to feel like I'm playing against another player. At no point here did I look past the mechanics and get drawn into a game. And at no point did the rules sort of clear away and allow me to get sucked in. And that's why I play solo games. I want to lose myself in the experience of figuring out a puzzle.
Yeah, I guess that was one of the main things. I just never was able to really get drawn in because it's a little too start and go with the different systems and just everything not quite clicking together like I would want.
In a market where you have your pick of solo games nowadays, and there are so many different things to pick from, that's just not really good enough anymore. There are plenty of ways to do a good and challenging and satisfying solo mode that doesn't feel like just a tacked on experience, and this just isn't it for me. For a lot of people, it sounds like it is. I've seen a lot of very positive reviews of this game, so This could be one of those instances where our tastes just don't quite line up with yours. And if that's the case, maybe watching a playthrough video might give you a better idea of whether this would be a good fit for you. But those are our thoughts on the game. And that means that's it for this episode. If you haven't yet, go on Facebook and follow us on there or on Instagram so you can see what we're playing and get a look at what we do when we're not recording here. You can send us an email at solosauruspodcast@gmail.com. And if you haven't already, go on to iTunes and review the show. It sounds like a small thing, but giving us a review allows us to show up in searches more often when other listeners go looking for shows like this, and it'll help them to find us more easily. Oh, and one more thing, pretty exciting thing actually. If you're on Board Game Geek, we have a micro badge now. So you can go on to the Board Game Geek forums and purchase a Solosaurus micro badge for 8 Geek Gold. If you don't have 8 Geek Gold, send me a message. My username is difficult to spell, so just search for Solosaurus or look for me in the forums and you'll be able to find me there. So contact me. I'll send you the Geek Gold you need in order to get the micro badge. And that's it for this episode. Until next time, I'm Brandon Waite.
And I'm Carter Mackey.
And this is Solosaurus.